Chapter 12. As Jane stepped from the train to the platform, a lady pounced on her with a cry of, "Is this Jane Victoria? Can this be my dear little Jane Victoria?" Jane did not like to be pounced on, and just then she was not feeling like anybody's Jane Victoria. She drew herself away and took in the lady with one of her straight, deliberate glances. A very pretty lady of perhaps 45 or 50, with large, pale blue eyes and smooth ripples of auburn hair around her placid, creamy face. Was this Aunt Irene? "Jane, if you please," she said, politely and distinctly. "For all the world like her grandmother Kennedy," Aunt Irene told her brother the next morning. Aunt Irene laughed, an amused little gurgle. "You dear funny child, of course it can be Jane. It can be just whatever you like. I am your Aunt Irene, but I suppose you've never heard of me." "Yes, I have." Jane kissed Aunt Irene's cheek obediently. "Grandmother told me to remember her to you." "Oh!" Something a little hard crept into Aunt Irene's sweet voice. "That was very kind of her. Very kind indeed. And now I suppose you're wondering why your father isn't here. He lives out at Brookview, you know, but that dreadful old car of his broke down halfway. He phoned in to me that he couldn't possibly get in tonight, but would be along early in the morning, and would I meet you and keep you for the night? Oh, Mrs. Stanley, you're not going before I've thanked you for bringing our dear little girl safely down to us. We're so much obliged to you." "Not at all. It's been a pleasure," said Mrs. Stanley, politely and untruthfully. She hurried away, thankful to be relieved of the odd, silent child who had looked all the way down as if she were an early Christian martyr on her path to the lions. Jane herself felt herself alone in the universe. Aunt Irene did not make a bit of difference. Jane did not like Aunt Irene, and she liked herself still less. What was the matter with her? Couldn't she like anybody? Other girls liked some of their uncles and aunts at least. She followed Aunt Irene out to the waiting taxi. "It's a terrible night, lovey, but the country needs rain. We've been suffering for weeks. You must have brought it with you. But we'll soon be home. I'm so glad to have you. I've been telling your father he ought to let you stay with me anyhow. It's really foolish of him to take you out to Brookview. He only boards there, you know. 2 rooms over Jim Mead's store. Of course he comes to town in the winter. But, well, perhaps you don't know, Jane, darling, how very determined your father can be when he makes up his mind." "I don't know anything about him," said Jane desperately. "I suppose not. I suppose your mother has never talked to you about him." "No," Jane answered reluctantly. Somehow Aunt Irene's question seemed charged with hidden meaning. Jane was to learn this was characteristic of Aunt Irene's questions. Aunt Irene squeezed Jane's hand, which she had held ever since she had helped her into the taxi, sympathetically. "You poor child, I know exactly how you feel, and I couldn't feel it was the right thing for your father to send for you. I'm sure I don't know why he did it. I couldn't fathom his motive, although your father and I have always been very close to each other, very close, lovey. I am 10 years older than he is, and I've always been more like a mother to him than a sister. Here we are at home, lovey." Home! The house to which Jane was ushered was cozy and sleek, just like Aunt Irene herself. But Jane felt about as much at home as a sparrow alone on an alien housetop. In the living room, Aunt Irene took off her hat and coat, patted her hair, and put her arm around Jane. "Now let me look you over. I hadn't a chance in the station, and I haven't seen you since you were 3 years old." Jane didn't want to be looked over and shrank back a little stiffly. She felt that she was being appraised, and in spite of Aunt Irene's kindness of voice and manner, she sensed that there was something in the appraisal not wholly friendly. "You are not at all like your mother. She was the prettiest thing I ever saw. You are like your father, darling. And now we must have a bite of supper." "Oh, no, please no," cried Jane impulsively. She knew she couldn't swallow a mouthful. It was misery to think of trying. "Just a bite, just one little bite," said Aunt Irene persuasively, as if coaxing a baby. "There's such a nice chocolate peppermint cake. I really made it for your father. He's just like a boy in some ways, you know. Such a sweet tooth. And he has always thought my chocolate cakes just about perfection. Your mother did try so hard to learn to make them like mine, but, well, it's a gift. You have it or you haven't. One really couldn't expect a lovely little doll like her to be a cook, or a manager either, for that matter, and I told your father that often enough. Men don't always understand, do they? They expect everything in a woman. Sit here, Janie." Perhaps the Janey was the last straw. Jane was not going to be Janied. "Thank you, Aunt Irene," she said very politely and very resolutely, "but I can't eat anything, and it wouldn't be any use at all to try. Please may I go to bed?" Aunt Irene patted her shoulder. "Of course, you poor darling. You're all tired out and everything's so strange. I know how hard it is for you. I'll take you right upstairs to your room." The room was very pretty, with hangings of basket weave, berosed cretonne, and a silk-covered bed, so smooth and sleek it looked as if it had never been slept in. But Aunt Irene deftly removed the silk spread and turned down the sheets. "I hope you'll have a good sleep, lovey. You don't know what it means to me to have you sleeping under my roof. Andrew's little girl, my only niece. And I was always so fond of your mother, but, well, I don't quite think she ever liked me. I always felt she didn't, but I never let it make any difference between us. She didn't like to see me and your father talking so much together. I always realized that. She was so much younger than your father, a mere child. It was natural for him to turn to me for advice, as he'd always been used to do. He always talked things over with me first. She was a little jealous, I think. She could hardly help that, being Mrs. Robert Kennedy's daughter. Never let yourself be jealous, Janey. It wrecks more lives than anything else. Here's a puff, lovey, if you're chilly in the night. A wet night in P.E. Island is apt to be cool. Good night, lovey." Jane stood alone in the room and looked about her. The bed lamp had a lampshade painted with roses with a bead fringe. For some reason, Jane couldn't endure that lampshade. It was too smooth and pretty, just like Aunt Irene. She went to it and put out the light. Then she went to the window. Beat, beat went the rain on the panes. Splash, splash went the rain on the roof of the veranda. Beyond it, Jane could see nothing. Her heart swelled. This black, alien, starless land could never be home to her. "If only I had Mother," she whispered. But though she felt that something had taken her life and torn it apart, she did not cry.